Hi, thanks for watching. In this lesson, we're going to talk about commas, the 10 commandments. And we have 3 objectives for this lesson. First objective is to understand the 10 major comma rules. These are all the rules that you need to know, all the most important rules. We're going to look at examples for each rule so you can really clearly see how to use the commas and how not to use the commas. And hopefully by the end of this lesson, you're going to be able to use commas effectively for the rest of your life and avoid unnecessary commas. How are we going to do that? By using a little strategy that I like to call the 10 commandments of commas. So the 10 commandments of commas are, thou shalt place commas in the following 10 areas. Before a coordinating conjunction to connect two independent ideas. You might remember that from grammar lesson 1. After a subordinate phrase in a complex sentence. You might remember that from lesson 1 as well. After an introductory word group. Between items in a series. Between coordinate adjectives, not cumulative. Around non-restrictive elements. Before or after transitional or parenthetical expressions. Before or after a direct address of the words yes or no. Before or after signal phrases for quotes. You might remember this one from our quoting APA style lesson. In dates, titles, and addresses. So those are the 10 that we're going to review in this lesson, and let's jump into it. So the first area that you want to always use commas, this one we talked about before, is before a coordinating conjunction in a compound sentence. Be sure to obey. Remember from our first grammar lesson, a compound sentence is a sentence that's created by connecting two independent ideas into a single sentence. And you can either use a semicolon, remember, to connect the two independent ideas, or you can use a comma and a coordinating conjunction, like one of the fanboys conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So if you use a semicolon, obviously you don't need a comma, but if you use a coordinating conjunction, you need the comma. So this is the first most important comma rule. Always make sure you use a comma with a coordinate conjunction to connect two independent ideas into a compound sentence. Bill went fishing, comma, but Ted stayed home. Flying over the city at night is exciting, comma, so I hope to take you this weekend. Here again, two independent ideas. Want to connect them into one sentence, you need the comma and the coordinating conjunction. In this case, so. Making compound sentences is fun, comma, but don't forget a comma if you use the coordinating conjunction. Rule number 1, make sure you use it when you're connecting two independent ideas into a compound sentence with a coordinating conjunction. Rule number 2, this one you probably also remember from grammar lesson 1, which is make sure you use a comma after a subordinate phrase in a complex sentence. So in our first unit, we discussed this one again. So a complex sentence, you might remember from that one, has one complete idea and one subordinate idea. If you start a sentence with a subordinate idea and then end with a complete idea, you need a comma after the subordinate idea. However, if you start a complex sentence with a complete idea and end with a subordinate idea, then you don't use a comma. Let's take a quick look at an example. Here, this sentence starts with a subordinate idea. If she asked me to go with her. See, that can't stand on its own. It's a subordinate idea, comma, I will wear my best shirt. That is a complete idea. I will wear. So here, starts with a subordinate idea, ends with a complete idea. We need the comma. Here's the reverse. If you start with a complete idea, I will wear my best shirt if she asks me to go. No comma. So don't put a comma here. Only if you start with the subordinate idea. Here's another example. Although many people forget them in complex sentences, comma, commas are necessary. And again, if we flip it around, commas are necessary, although people forget them in complex sentences. So there you go. Rule number 2. Also, you might remember from the first grammar lesson, make sure you use a comma after a subordinate phrase in a complex sentence. Rule number 3. So this one's new. Make sure you use a comma after an introductory word group. So an introductory word group tells the reader when, where, how, why, or under what conditions the main action of a sentence occurred. When you use an introductory word group, you need a comma after the introductory phrase. Here's an example. Over the river and through the woods, you will find Grandma's house. So here is an introductory phrase. It's telling us where, over the river and through the woods. So we need the comma after this introductory phrase. And here's the main part of the sentence. You will find Grandma's house. So if you start with an introductory phrase like this, you need a comma after it. Here's another example. On a dark and stormy night, comma, we set off on our trip. So here it's kind of specifying the night. So we need the comma after the introductory idea. After leaving, she drove to the mechanic. So here, after leaving kind of specifies the time when she drove to the mechanic. Here's another one. Flying over the field, the pilot executed a maneuver. So the sentence is, the pilot executed the maneuver, and this is specifying where. So we have an introductory sentence, introductory phrase that specifies where, flying over the field. So we need the comma after it. So anytime you start a sentence with a phrase like this that specifies when, where, how, why, or under what conditions the main action of a sentence occurred, you need a comma after that introductory idea. 4. You need commas between items in a series. So this one's pretty straightforward too, although people often forget the final comma in a series. So whenever you have 3 or more items in a list, you need commas between each of the items, including the last item before the word and. And this is the one that some people often forget. And it's actually not our fault because newspapers often don't include this comma so that they can save space on publishing. But in academic writing, you do need the comma before the and. At dinner last night, and actually here's an introductory phrase, which is why we have a comma here. At dinner last night, I ate crab, comma, shrimp, comma, sausage, comma, and chicken in a jambalaya. So here we have items in a series, crab, shrimp, sausage, and chicken. We put commas between each of the items and including the last item before the and. So always make sure you include that comma as well. Here's another example. Commas, comma, semicolon, comma, apostrophes, comma, and quotation marks are the most important punctuations. So here's a sentence that starts with a series, and we have more than 3, and we need commas between each of the items, including this last comma before the and. Commas, comma, semicolon, commas, apostrophes, comma, and quotation marks are the most important punctuations. Here's another one. On the way home, so again we need this comma because we have another introductory phrase here. On the way home, I need to pick up the dry cleaning, comma, get the car washed, comma, and stop at the grocery store. So in this one, we don't have single items like we did with these two. We have longer phrases in a list. So we have several things that this person needs to do on the way home. Pick up the dry cleaning, comma, get the car washed, comma, and stop at the grocery store. So you always want to make sure when you're using a series that you're putting the commas between each of the items in the series. Here's the last one. It's a set of directions with a longer phrases in a series. To load a boat on the trailer. So again, here we have an introductory phrase. So with most of these, we actually have introductory phrases as well. So we have this comma. Back the trailer into the water, comma, pull the boat up onto the trailer, comma, strap down the sides, comma, and pull the car out. So here are the 4 steps you need to do to load the boat on the trailer. Back it into the water, comma, pull it up onto the trailer, comma, strap down the sides, comma, and pull the car out, period. So because we have several items in the series, we need commas between all of them. So that's the commandment number 4 of commas. Commandment number 5, make sure you use commas between coordinate adjectives. So when 2 or more adjectives modify a noun separately, they are coordinate because each of them is working independently of the other. Look at that big, white, puffy cloud. So here we have three adjectives describing the cloud, big, white, and puffy, and they're all working independently, so we use commas here between them. So when two or more adjectives work together to modify a noun, they're cumulative adjectives. And with cumulative adjectives, no commas. She's wearing a dark gray sweater. So in this one, dark and gray are working together to modify sweater. So we don't put a comma here. If they were working independently, we would put commas in between, but dark and gray are sort of cumulative. They're building one off the other, so no comma in here. So here's the rule. You need commas between coordinate adjectives, but do not use them between cumulative adjectives. She is a fast, nimble, committed runner. Each of these is describing the runner independently. Fast, nimble, committed. So we put commas between each of them. Fast, nimble, committed runner. He is a strong, trustworthy, loyal worker. So each of these is describing the worker independently. Strong, trustworthy, and loyal. So we put the commas in between. Take a look at the other example. Pick up 2 light roast coffees. So in this case, 2 light roast are all building off of one another to describe the coffee. So 2 light roast coffees wouldn't have commas in between because you need each of these to work together to describe the coffee. Pick up 2 light roast coffees. So no commas in there. Let's look at another one. She is an extremely smart person. So extremely describes smart, which describes the person. So these again are cumulative. They're building one off the other, so they don't. So you don't use commas in between. So this rule is a little bit tricky. There is one thing that can help you with the rule, and that is if you can put the word "and" between each of the adjectives, then you would use a comma. So the test is, she is a fast and nimble and committed runner. So it doesn't sound that awkward to put fast and nimble and committed runner, so we can put the commas in there. Same with this one. He is a strong and trustworthy and loyal worker. So it makes sense with the ands there. But if we say, pick up 2 and light and roast coffees, the and doesn't make any sense because they're building one off the other. She is an extremely and smart person. That doesn't make any sense either. So that's the test right there for do you have coordinate adjectives or cumulative adjectives, is if you can replace it with and, then you would use the comma. If it doesn't make sense to replace it with the and, then no comma because they're cumulative. They're building off the other. Also with coordinate adjectives, the comma can actually clarify the meaning of the adjectives, and a sentence would be completely different without the comma. Look at that huge hot dog. Look at that huge and hot dog. So these two are describing the dog separately. So the dog is huge and the dog is hot. Right? So look at that huge and hot dog. So we get a picture of a big dog that's very hot. But if we don't put the comma in, look at that huge hot dog. Now, since huge and hot dog are working together, we're actually talking about a hot dog, like the kind of dog that you would see in a bun. So look at that huge hot dog. Right? So we have two totally different sentences because of this comma. One is a huge and hot dog. The other one is just a huge hot dog. Commandment number 5, coordinate adjectives. Make sure you test it with the word and. If they're coordinate in that they describe independently, use the commas. If they're cumulative in that they work together, no commas. So number 6, make sure you use commas around non-restrictive items. This is actually probably the most difficult of all the comma rules. Let's take a look at it. So a restrictive clause is a clause that limits the meaning of a word or phrase because it contains essential information. The boy who comes to my house regularly was late. So in this case, the phrase, who comes to my house regularly, is limiting the boy. So the boy was late today is not the same as the boy who comes to my house regularly was late today. This is essential information, so we don't put commas around it because it's a restrictive phrase. So the boy who comes to my house regularly was late today. No commas. A non-restrictive clause is one that describes a word or phrase but does not contain essential information. It contains parenthetical information, or information that's not essential to the sentence and not that important. John, who comes to my house regularly, was late today. So in this case, who comes to my house regularly is sort of like a side note or parenthetical, right? The sentence is the same. John was late today, or John, who comes to my house regularly, was late today. So here's the rule. You need to put commas around all non-restrictive phrases. So if the phrase isn't that important to the sentence, make sure you put commas around it. The man with six fingers was charged with robbery. So here the phrase with 6 fingers is limiting the man, so it's an essential part of the sentence. The man with 6 fingers was charged with robbery is different than the man was charged with robbery, because with 6 fingers is an essential characteristic of the man, so we don't put commas around this because this is a restrictive phrase. The carpenter who has 6 fingers was in an accident yesterday. So the difference is subtle, but in this case, the carpenter was in an accident yesterday. Who has 6 fingers is kind of a parenthetical note in this particular sentence. The carpenter, who happens to have 6 fingers, was in an accident yesterday. The 6 fingers isn't an essential characteristic of the man in this sentence. So this is why this rule is kind of tricky, because the difference is sort of subtle. And actually it's not written in stone what's essential and what's non-essential. The test for it is if you can take the phrase out and it doesn't alter the meaning of the sentence that much, then it's probably restrictive. The carpenter, cover up who has 6 fingers, the carpenter was in an accident yesterday, still makes sense. The 6 fingers isn't that important. The man was charged with robbery is much different than the man with 6 fingers was charged with robbery. So the sentence loses meaning if we take it out. So that's how you test if something's restrictive or non-restrictive. The pen that was on the table suddenly rolled off. So this one's a little bit more obvious. The pen suddenly rolled off is much different than the pen that was on the table suddenly rolled off. The sentence actually doesn't make that much sense if we say the pen suddenly rolled off. That was on the table is an essential part of the sentence. Here's another one. The book, which is long, ends well. So which is long isn't really that important to the sentence. The sentence is about how the book ends well. Which is long is kind of a side note, so we put commas around it. One other thing to notice here is that and which. The difference between that and which is you use that around restrictive phrases and which in non-restrictive phrases. So as a general rule, you always put commas around phrases that have the word which, no commas around that. So that's actually the difference between that and which. The pen that was on the table suddenly rolled off. Since it's an essential part of the sentence, we use that, we don't put commas around it. The book, which is long, ends well. Since this is non-essential, we use which, and we put commas around it. So there's a nice side note to this lesson. The difference between that and which is that is for restrictive, which is for non-restrictive. So sometimes the commas change the meaning of the sentence. So this is a good example from the Hacker book. The dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious. Versus, the dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious. So in this case, we have the exact same sentence. But if we view made with fresh raspberries as an essential part of the sentence, we don't put commas around it. And here, the dessert made with fresh raspberries this is how the dessert is always made. The dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious versus the dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious. In this case, made with fresh raspberries is kind of a side note. Usually the dessert isn't made with fresh raspberries, but in this situation it was. So here we can see that the difference between essential and non-essential items is sometimes up to the writer to decide, which is why this is one of the harder rules. And it does change the meaning of the sentence. The dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious is different than the dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious. So there's non-restrictive items. It's probably the most difficult one. I would suggest watching this a couple of times and also read the Hacker section that talks a little bit about it. Commandment 6. Make sure you use commas before or after transitional or parenthetical expressions. So this one is pretty straightforward. You need commas around all transitional expressions or transitional phrases. The girl, however, got away. So the word however is a transitional phrase, so we put commas around it. The girl, however, got away. However, comma, the girl got away. The girl got away, comma, however. So whenever you're including a transitional phrase, you need commas around it. If it's at the beginning of the sentence, you obviously don't have a comma before it, you just put one after. If it's at the end of a sentence, you obviously don't have a comma after, but you put one before. If it's in the middle of the sentence, put commas around the whole phrase. Here's a longer example. Fast food, comma, for example, is not very healthy. So in this case, for example, is a transitional phrase or expression, so we put commas around it. So you also need commas around parenthetical expressions, which are unessential aspects of sentences. So a parenthetical expression is something that you kind of say as a side note within a sentence, and it's non-restrictive, so you put commas around it. The boy, comma, so I'm told, comma, was not so lucky. So this so I'm told isn't really important to the sentence, it's just kind of a side note added into the sentence. It's non-restrictive, so we put commas around it. We can go down to the river if you are so inclined and fish there. So here, if you're so inclined, is non-restrictive, parenthetical. It's sort of added into the sentence. It doesn't really change the meaning of the sentence, so we put commas around it. So commandment 8, make sure you use commas in direct addresses. So whenever you're calling somebody by name in writing, you need commas before, after, or around the name. Joe, comma, hand me that hammer. Since we need a period here too. But since we're addressing Joe directly, we put comma after it. Hand me that hammer, Joe. So here again, we put the comma before Joe since we're addressing him directly. It would be great, Joe, if you could join us. So in this case, we have commas around Joe because we're addressing him in the middle of the sentence. This rule can actually save someone's life. Let's eat, Grandma, versus let's eat, Grandma. The latter is not very nice to do to your grandma. The former is very polite. Let's eat, Grandma. So this is a sort of funny example of how you need commas around direct addresses in order to save people's lives. So you also need commas if you use the word yes or no as part of an address. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. So in this one we have both rules. Since we're starting with yes, we put a comma here, but we also need commas around Virginia since we're addressing her directly. Yes, comma, Virginia, comma, there is a Santa Claus. No, comma, I can't go. So here, whenever you're addressing somebody directly with yes or no, you need a comma around it. So there's number 8, direct addresses. Let's take a look at number 9. You need commas before or after signal phrases to quote. So you might remember this from our quoting and APA section. Whenever you're going to introduce a quote with an incomplete idea, you need the comma after the signal phrase. According to Smith, 2006, comma, autism is increasing, page 6, period. So we start the sentence with an incomplete thought, we need the comma here. Autism is increasing, comma, according to Smith, 2006, page 6. So also notice that the comma goes inside the quotes here, too, if you're putting a signal phrase after a quote in a sentence. So you need the comma either after a signal phrase introducing a quote or before a signal phrase if the signal phrase is at the end of a sentence. Here's another example. Then God said, comma, thou shalt not steal. So here again, we need the comma since we're introducing with an incomplete idea. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, comma, said the Lord, period. So here again, if we have the signal phrase at the end of a sentence, we need the comma before it. So let's move on to our final commandment. Commandment 10, you need commas in dates, titles, and addresses. So you need commas after the day and the year if you include them in a sentence. On July 4th, 2015, we will celebrate the next Independence Day. So whenever you include a date or a year in a sentence, you need them both, except if the year is at the end of a sentence. Independence Day is on July 4th, 2015. That one's pretty straightforward. Here's another one. You need commas around titles if they follow names. John Smith, PhD, will be leading. Susan Smith, MD, performed the operation. So when we're including titles, we put commas around them. Finally, all elements of addresses need commas, except before a zip code. So we'd say, she lives at 10 Main Street, Boston, Massachusetts, USA, 01848. So we put commas between each of the items in the address except before the zip code. Send it to 53 Wake Street, Lawrence, Mass. 01880. So here again, in all of the items, we have commas except before the final one. So there you have it, the 10 commandments. Now let's just wrap up real quick. Here you are with your 10 commandments. Don't forget the 10 commandments of comma use. Thou shalt place commas in the following 10 areas. Before a coordinating conjunction to connect two independent ideas. After a subordinate phrase in a complex sentence. After an introductory word group. Between items in a series. Between coordinate adjectives but not cumulative adjectives. Around non-restrictive elements. Before or after transitional parenthetical expressions. Before or after direct addresses or the words yes and no. Before or after signal phrases for quotes. And in dates, titles, and addresses. So if you remember these 10 simple rules, right, they're all relatively straightforward. Some of the toughest ones are the ones that we already talked about. The one that's really difficult is probably the non-restrictive. But if you can get the idea of non-restrictive and parenthetical expressions and how to identify those in sentences, that's one of the major, that's probably one of the hardest parts of doing commas. All the other ones relatively straightforward. If you can remember these 10, you'll be a comma whiz.